So thank you so much, Peter, for taking the time to meet with me today. I really appreciate everything that you are. You and I have worked together for many, many years, and I've done a lot of research into your career, and I've, at least since we met, have been following your work steadily, and I really admire everything you've been able to achieve. But I want to start off just going back into your personal history, kind of your anecdotes, and dig into when you first became aware of this idea of universal design.
Well, thank you, Anthony. It's a pleasure to talk with you, and your career has been the same, extraordinary to watch. About me, don't believe everything you read, but thank you for that nice introduction. In the early 1990s, I was just beginning a teaching career in Iowa, which is a very fine law school, and happened to be the home state of a senator, a United States senator named Tom Harkin, who was one of the drafters of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I began working with his group and studying the early implementation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And one area of particular controversy was workplace accommodations or adjustments, assistive technology. Today we have flexible scheduling, working from home. But in the early days, pre a lot of this new technology, was some assistive devices and the physical nature of the workspace. And a lot of concern was about preventing workplace injury and getting people back into the workplace. So I was commissioned by the Annenberg Foundation to do one of the first, fortunately, large studies of workplace accommodations soon after the ADA was passed, and had access to a company called Sears Roebuck, which at the time was one of the largest companies of its kind. Retail had a catalog. If they had only made that into an Amazon type platform, the Sears Roebuck catalog today we'd be looking at instead of Amazon.com. So I went in and immersed myself at Sears and looked at their company really from the top to the bottom, from the CEO, a man named Brennan at the time, to their work sites. And I studied their accommodations, in particular, the cost of the accommodations, because one of the critiques of the ADA by the naysayers was that there's going to be an extraordinary cost to these accommodations. One accommodation that stuck out in my mind, even to this day, was at that time, if somebody injured their back, they put on these Velcro back supporters. They're black with suspenders. Many of us have seen them probably to help with back injury. Well, the interesting thing was, as I began studying these and accommodations, lo and behold, very quickly, they realized that this, quote, accommodation for a person who had injured their back would prevent back injuries for everybody who was stocking shelves and in the retail stores. And before you know it, you know what? They required everybody to wear those back braces so that it would benefit people with disabilities, but at the same time promote safety throughout the whole workplace. And I must say, a lot of people are aware of this, but at that time, I remember the light bulb went off, and I began to think and write about the nature of accommodations and the so-called ripple effects of accommodations and the ways in which they can promote a better workplace for everybody. And I wrote a number of articles that you're probably aware of, and others that have picked up a little bit of attention, quite a bit of attention actually, about the direct and indirect costs and benefits of accommodations. And the indirect benefits in this case was a healthier workforce, a better work environment, and a safer workplace. Paired with that, as a lawyer and a researcher, a psychologist, I was always interested in attitudes and perceptions of the law. When you have a law like the Americans with Disabilities Act, or perhaps other laws like that around the world, sometimes employers or others sort of play to the minimum. In other words, if there's a rule, in the case of the ADA, there are ADA accessibility guidelines. Well, many lawyers, unfortunately, might advise their clients, comply with that and no more. Just focus on what you have to do under the law, and you're not required, quote, to do more. Well, another light bulb, of course, went off for me and many people. And I'm not a poker player or a blackjack player, but I've always liked the expression, there are many ways to get to 21, meaning that there are many ways to get 21 in blackjack. And I always felt that those companies that I studied were not only innovative and had an organizational culture of innovation, but they understood that in order to excel profit-wise in what they were doing, they needed to transcend minimal, quote, compliance with laws and other sorts of ways of doing business. Around this time, I was giving a talk in Syracuse, in New York City, actually, at a club to business owners and lawyers and others. And I was talking about the Sears studies and ideas of transcending compliance with the law in ways that make business sense. And Josh Hines, who was the general counsel and the lawyer for a man who sadly has just passed away named Robert Conjal, was in the audience. And Robert Conjal was a billionaire, and he made his money building malls, shopping malls. Today we have a different environment with COVID and malls, but building about 40 very successful shopping malls across the United States. And he had built in Syracuse, because it was his hometown, like the 14th most busy mall in the United States, a huge mall which drew from all over New York and Canada. And now it's called Destiny Mall. It used to be called Carousel Mall because they had a big carousel in the entranceway. So Josh told Bob about my studies and work about transcendence and accommodation and going beyond minimal compliance in ways that made business sense. And this brilliant businessman asked me to have dinner with him and Josh. And he said, because I had talked about how many people with disabilities and the consumer base, and that some of my best friends say, well, if I use a wheelchair and I can't get into a restaurant, they not only lose my meal ticket and dollars, but the 6 people I'm bringing with me. So clearly there was a big economic impact for a broader approach to understanding design and business. And of course, I was aware of Ron Mace's groundbreaking work in universal design and universal design principles. But Bob Conjal, being the businessman, great businessman who he was, said, why would I exclude 20,000 people a day from my malls who happen to use wheelchairs or walkers or who are older when those dollars could go into my company's cash registers? Now, he wasn't as mercenary as that. He understood the value of inclusivity, but it was a business decision. So he convened this international meeting at his private convention center. You know, billionaires can have these sorts of things. And first of all, made it totally accessible.
Nice.
And we invited people, design experts and architects and lawyers and disability community advocates from all over the country and the world. And in a short story, we had this convening, and then we ended up working with the Destiny Mall, which is still in Syracuse, to try to work on aspects of it so that it was universally designed. That is, maximize its usability for as many people as possible.
Sure.
Independent of that, Bob, who was a visionary, I don't know whether you know this or not, you know the LEED standards, which are the
Yeah.
LEED standards are
Hmm.
building standards for accessible buildings and safe buildings and building certification.
Yeah. Yeah.
They have to do with sustainability and other sorts of things. So Bob and others, myself, said, well, there's no such thing for, quote, accessibility, i.e., universal design. Why don't we think about organizing a group which became the Global Universal Design Not for Profit Commission
Hmm.
to both work with companies, now we're into technology and other areas as well, as you know, around the world, to try to figure out how to go beyond minimal compliance in the law in
Mm.
innovative ways that make business sense. Now,
Mm.
the amazing thing to me about universal design, and to somewhat with accessibility as well, there's no one way of universal design.
Yeah.
For example, with accessibility, under the law, something may be accessible to a wheelchair user, but at the same time, not at all accessible to a person who is blind.
Hmm.
And I hear a lot about wheelchair users who have to go over, they're not complaining, but the bumps of the dots in the road, which are there to help
Mm.
people with sensory impairments realize there's a change in the curb slope.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so not all accessibility issues work in tandem.
Yeah. Sure.
What we tried to do with the Global Universal Design Commission, and we are doing now, I think successfully, but not at the level of leads, because that's kind of the way we want it right now, is to
Hmm.
work with large companies on living laboratories about the ways in which we can explore universal design on the basis of their business. So there's no
Mm.
one size that fits all. We've done
Yeah.
case studies, we've done certification standards, which we have developed, but there are many types of certification standards that can be used. And the
Absolutely.
universal design, as you know, thanks to you, Anthony, you're a board member, has elements working throughout Scandinavia and Europe, in
Mm.
South America, in Africa, and
Hmm.
um, and we've been very fortunate that this has caught on. So
Mm.
that is kind of a quick and dirty sort of history of how this passion has developed. The
Mm.
honorary chairman of the Global Universal Design Commission is a gentleman named Ambassador Luis Gallegos, who was also, the stars align, one of the great sponsors behind the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities.
Yeah.
And now he is Secretary of State of Ecuador. But he had introduced me to, a while back, the then Vice President of Ecuador named Lenin Moreno, who
Mm.
sadly the use of his legs and uses a wheelchair as a result of being shot, a
Mm.
drive-by shooting in Ecuador. And lo and behold, today he is President Moreno of
Okay.
Ecuador. And before the pandemic, I was down there working with him to cut the ribbon on their new convention center and airport. And now we want to look at the palace to make sure it's accessible to all or universally designed to all.
That is so incredible. And I love that you were kind of working in universal design before universal design was even a thing. I think that's amazing. But I want to turn to a different
Well,
part of your career. Go
at
ahead.
least before I knew of it, there had been others who, Ron Mace and others, who
Mm.
have really pioneered the field much more than I
Mm.
have. But I tried to further adapt it to the
Mm.
disability community as an element of the disability rights
Mm.
activities, which other people have done, of course, as well. And throughout Europe, you have Design for All and many groups that are working on these issues. The
Mm.
GUDC, or the Global Universal Design Commission, is specifically meant to be an international nonprofit body to promote these issues now in technology, in housing, and of course in the business environment.
Yeah. And I think it's that evolution, I think, that matters so much about universal design. Is it's not just a static thing that was created and now we're trying to just wedge it into other areas, but it's been evolving over the last decades. And I think that's something that really, for me as a young scholar and as an entrepreneur, is very encouraging. But I want to turn to a different part of your career, because I know you were involved in some lawsuits around web accessibility there in Norway, or there in the US. And I would love, I mean, a lot of people, the only relationship they have with a courtroom is kind of through TV. But I would love to hear just the stories behind some of that litigation and some of the work that you were able to do. I mean, were you in the courtroom in some of these instances? Was it more desk work, or how did it happen?
Well, that's a very interesting and important topic, technology, which goes to universal design as well.
Mm.
I'm making a pause because I want to tell you two more things, if I may, about universal design before we switch to that, before I forget. When the GUDC took off, I was approached by architects who were designing a new YMCA in Michigan. And they had this innovative idea that they wanted to make it universally designed. As a matter of fact, the first universally designed YMCA of its kind. So I went up to Michigan to the construction site in the mud, I remember, and into the construction trailer. And the architects and the designers showed me they rolled out the plans. They said, here are beautiful plans, take a look. And lo and behold, the first thing I see is this iconic staircase entering into this YMCA. Now, they may have had a heart attack or scratched their heads and so forth, but I said what's obvious, kind of not in a pretentious way. Can we kind of get rid of that staircase and put in a ramp? And they all scratched their heads and thought about it for a second. And you know what? Long story short, that YMCA today in Grand Rapids, Michigan, is a showpiece for the whole chain. And there is an iconic, I wouldn't even call it a ramp. It's an entranceway that uses a ramp, but tells the story of the YMCA and is the introduction to the whole building.
That's awesome.
I don't know if your listeners may have been to New York City. There's a museum called the Guggenheim Museum, where you take an elevator up to the top floor and you go down in a circle on a ramps to see the museum. Very innovative building. And you know, this fix at the YMCA was so simple and intuitive. And we are now doing studies on the YMCA, and compared to comparable new YMCAs, we've just published some of these. The colleagues at the YMCA have published these. I can't take credit for them. The attendance is up, consumer satisfaction is up, family usage is up. And so this was a terrific illustration of this principle in work. One more story, and then we'll talk about technology.
Sure, yes. I love the stories. Keep going.
I won't say the name of this architectural firm, but it's perhaps among the leading, most innovative architectural design firms in the world. So they they do universal design, and they're very interested in learning about the GUDC. And they asked if we would look at their New York City offices. And here's a picture of our New York City offices. Lo and behold, a historically beautiful New York City building, which happens to have a bank of stairs walking right up into it. This was on their website. Yeah, that's off their website now. Picture. But it was very interesting to me. And these are the most interesting, well-meaning, high-end people, you know, top of their game. But unless you have that mindset, even the best people professionally, you know, cannot think of these things. That's why it's so important to have diverse, multi-sectional, multiple individual identities involved and engaged. And in fact, that's what the GUDC is about as well. that it's truly a collaboration built by and with the disability, the gender, and all other race, ethnicity, because poverty plays into it as well, all other sorts of elements. And I think universal design has that ability to attract those sorts of individuals. Now on to technology. In 1990, when Tim Berners-Lee was inventing the World Wide Web, the Internet's World Wide Web, the Americans with Disabilities Act was just being signed into law. Nobody at the time the ADA was passed could conceive of the web as we know it today.
Right.
Nonetheless, early on in about the mid-1990s, I was asked to testify before the United States Congress on a very focused legal issue, which I had done some writing and research on. And that is, under the law of the Americans with Disabilities Act, places of public accommodation are covered by the law. Emphasis on the word places, which is in the law. Right. The question put to me and a few others was, is a place definition broad enough to encompass a cyber place, the World Wide Web? You can see this is a very lawyerly question because at my testimony, I pulled out the Oxford English Dictionary and read into the record the definition of a place, which to me certainly would encompass the web. After that, the web began to flourish. America Online, I don't know if you remember, and all these early web browsers, much before Facebook, MySpace, and places like that. There began to be issues for individuals who were blind to access the World Wide Web because often it was not built in ways that was consistent with screen reader technology.
Right.
So, for example, if you had an image on the web and you didn't put an alt tag description in, you didn't put it in the code, a description of what it was, this is a Picasso painting,
right,
then it would read nothing, or it would read alt tag. And other sorts of links and information on the web. So a group of advocates led by a young Berkeley student named Bruce Sexton, who was blind, sued Target Corporation. Target is like Carrefour or Walmart or one of these big Costco type chains. And on the grounds that the ADA ordered that they make their website accessible for people who were blind. And a mountain of litigation ensued in which we had court hearings. I was co-counsel with an amazing group of lawyers called Disability Rights Advocates. And I was lucky to tag along with these stellar attorneys, Larry Paradis, for example, who sadly has passed away. And we litigated for the first time in the country to successfully that the ADA was broad enough to cover the web. Now, this ties to universal design because the reality is, as we know today, it's not costly at all to make the websites universally usable by everybody. It's not like changing a physical building one at a time. So there are great cost efficiencies. There are huge numbers of people who are blind. There are subsequent cases, for example, about captioning for people who were deaf, which I was involved with against CNN, and we can talk about that. But essentially in this first case, the court held that as long as somebody was going to go to the store to pick up their goods, if the website was not accessible, then that violated the ADA. Now, subsequent to that, I was working with the same group representing a California group who were deaf, the Greater Los Angeles Association for the Deaf. GLAD, I think it was called.
Right.
And at that time, CNN was not captioning CNN.com. And we had litigation against CNN, which was eventually settled. But interestingly, there are a number of interesting aspects to that relevant to what we're talking about. Number one, CNN initially defended, saying that if they were forced to caption their website, it would violate their free speech rights because, in effect, we would be forcing them to speak in a different voice. Now, we won that, but it was a very interesting argument because, in essence, it really was just a mechanical translation of the words that were said. We also argued from a universal design perspective that there were great efficiencies here, not just for people who were deaf, but people with reading disabilities, people who had English as a second language. And today, of course, we have Google Translate and so forth. And there was terrific efficiencies for Target in the ability to present their information also in multiple languages, Spanish, French, whatever language was available. So that was another illustration of how we believed that a universal design approach to technology can benefit all. Now, interestingly, fast forward to today, there are questions about intellectual property and ownership. You're aware of the Marrakesh Treaty, of course, which had to do with the book famine and online books made available. That's a whole nother line of issues relating to who owns the information. But, for example, you remember that Picasso illustration I was telling you about earlier for an alt tag? Say somebody does describe in great, interesting detail that Picasso. Well, who owns that code? If it's not open source, who owns that description? Is it copyrightable? Is it intellectual property? Does the Picasso Family Foundation own it? And we're entering into we are in a new time now from a universal design perspective in a fight over who owns and controls the content, because content now is king and device is less relevant. With no rest for the wicked, I'm president of an organization called Raising the Floor USA, which is a nonprofit, which is part of a much larger entity internationally based in Geneva, I believe, organized by Greg Vander Heiden, a very famous technologist. And we are building something that is called, which is now being deployed, the inclusive web infrastructure. I forget what it was called. Now it's called a different name. I should know that. It'll come to me in a second. But essentially, the technologists have built a platform that allows content to be deployed accessibly based on individual preferences in the cloud on any device you might pick up anywhere, anytime. So this program, it's called Morphic now, taken from the Greek to morph, is basically used in libraries for people who don't have access to all sorts of information, can't afford a very expensive iPhone or smart tablet or something. So if you load your preferences in the cloud, when you sign in on any particular device, it will configure in bigger font, different contrast, captioning on, whatever you like. The idea being that the universality of the use should not be based on the particular device you're using, but based on your preferences that you imagine. Now, there should be a whole new market for that. And in fact, Apple and others essentially are doing that within their systems. You can configure your iPhone so that it's in an accessible format. What we're simply doing is trying to bring it to a more universal audience. So that's kind of the technology.
Yeah, I
And you
love it.
have
I
written
really, I'm just fascinated.
you have written a review of my book called Equality, which talks about a lot of these issues.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And one of those issues is this myth around universal design that it has to be a one size fits all. And I still come into contact with people who believe when you hear the word universal design, they think, oh, it's just a kind of bland, generic solution that's supposed to meet the needs of everybody. I'm just wondering if you could pick that apart for a second and kind of explain why that's not true.
Well, many times we're a compliance-driven, rule-driven people.
Hmm.
You know, the government sets out a minimal compliance standard. That's what we shall do. But for universal design, not only are there many ways to provide universal design, but I would say generally, I'd be interested in your reaction, it's much more dynamic. It can change over time and context, motivation, emotion, circumstance. I mean, if you think of your cell phone, I'm sitting in New York City and there are sirens going by, which is a situational disturbance, or I turn off my ringer. And to some extent, that's an accommodation. If I had attention deficit disorder, if I had some sort of other sort of disability, or just wanted to focus on context. So universal design, in my view, takes into account contextual issues and factors in a way that a more static accessibility level may not. And again, accessibility, as I said before, what may be accessible for you and I may not be accessible for somebody else. As to regard to the mindset you're talking about, I think that for many businesses who are advised by their lawyers sometimes, or governments, it's hard to think out of the box. You're basically trying to achieve a minimal level of compliance for everybody. But universal design is meant to go beyond that. And that's why I think it's hard to have hard law around universal design, other than that is aspirational, because it's not it's a concept more than a paradigm, more than a limitation.
Yeah, absolutely. You pick up on this idea just now around the relationship between universal design and innovation. I'm wondering if you could go into a little bit about that. How do you see these two constructs, these two ideas kind of connecting?
Well, if you think about from an economic point of view, put aside social rights and civil rights, which we, of course, support.
Yes.
In this day and age, there is such an emphasis on individualized approaches on the web. You know, basically buying and selling in such micro individualized ways, such micro markets we can tap into that we never would have thought of before, in customized goods, that individualized nature of the consumer world, embedded in that, there has to be a huge untapped market, just from a purely economic point of view. And creative companies understand that. And increasingly, that's why there's such a diversity of goods. And when the micro websites with these goods are so great, they're snapped up by the bigger companies and they become part of their portfolio. Unilever, which is a huge products company, owns Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Why? Well, probably there's terrific synergies with what Ben & Jerry's means. It's this hippie, all different flavors ice cream, but there has to be a psychological synergy of that to how they believe they can leverage their other products. And the web has made things so individualized in many ways that I think those companies that capture that innovative approach will drive, will in large part drive the economy going forward. And take autonomous vehicles or autonomous
Yeah.
item. The whole AI infrastructure and
Mm.
development, artificial
Mm.
intelligence that's going to be embedded
Mm.
with the World Wide Web and consumer goods, that
Mm.
will further enhance, it should, the individualized nature of these goods. For example, you think of an autonomous vehicle, and I've talked about this and written about this. That can be your bedroom, that can be your office,
Mm.
that can be recreational room, that can be
Mm.
presented to you in ways in which you are comfortable or strongest in terms of learning, reading, thinking,
Mm.
entry into the vehicle itself. And the same is going to be true for many
Mm.
other types of devices as well. So, universally
Yeah.
designed consumer goods tied with artificial intelligence. I don't particularly like the term, but some people use the term cognitive orthotics. Essentially, they'll
Okay.
whole ways of approaching thinking and learning based on this marriage with artificial intelligence. Of course, the flip side of that is security, privacy, individuality,
Mm.
and data security, big data.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Uh, there's so much I want to cover here. Let's start with this issue of security, privacy, and individuality. Where do you see the future going in that area with respect to universal design and some of the other key themes we've talked about? What if you could paint me a picture in 5 years' time or 10 years' time? Where do you think we're going to end up?
Well, this is maybe not an end up, but this is an ongoing issue. Security,
Mm.
privacy are obviously paramount issues
Mm.
today. Remember, I talked about the GPII, the Global
Mm.
Public Inclusive Infrastructure, which has become morphic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, putting your health and medical and disability information in the cloud, along with other financial information, so that you can use that to personalize devices, obviously, if not done well, carries terrific risks with it. Think about the
Mm.
autonomous vehicle. The
Mm.
hacking capability, the hacking downside of that is terrific from all
Yeah.
sorts of dimensions. And we're
Mm.
going to have to increasingly figure out. You're much better at this than I am from a technology point of view, but perhaps interestingly, we may revert to a more localized sense of
Mm.
security and privacy and identity
Mm.
in ways that link up with the World Wide Web or the internet that further foster
Mm.
this sense of control, privacy, independence in life. For the disability community, of course, we don't want the autonomous vehicle to be, quote, paternalistic in the same way that a segregated van taking people who use wheelchairs is separated from
Mm.
society. So
Yeah.
these are real problems, and they
Yeah.
go to the future balance of this technology and individual rights in society. I hope that in 5 or 10 years from
Mm.
now, we will have moved forward to a more individually controlled approach to these issues, but not to the point where we have a chip in our arm which verifies who we are and holds our data and links
Yeah.
it to the satellite that calls the car. Who knows if we'll have
Yeah. Yeah.
cell phones or tablets in 5 to 10 years. I do think things like Google
Mm.
Glass and all these smart clothing and other sorts of things are very important, but we will have to learn as we go.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Hopefully evolve as we go too. Well, what do you think about this
Um,
issue of like two steps forward, one step back? I think a lot of the work that we end up doing, we see strides made, and then it seems like right after we've broken ground, there's just a little bit of a pushback from whomever, industry, anyone, kind of just decides, whoa, 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 this is enough in terms of rights or in terms of progress, and we end up having to move back a little bit. Do you have any kind of words of wisdom here? How to cope with that?
well, I don't know. I don't know wisdom, but that seems to be part of the human condition,
Mm,
whether it's with the introduction of the automobile or with the introduction of the internet.
mm,
The ocean waves come in and they recede a little bit, and perhaps that is endemic to advancement in
yeah.
some ways. Perhaps that is learning, what
Mm,
we call learning.
mm,
And just as a child learns not to touch fire, there has to be a natural component of that in which
mm,
people, sometimes bad actors, will
mm.
test those boundaries. And I
Yeah.
think that it's hard to think of a natural learning paradigm without that. Of course, it's unfortunate that people may suffer or be harmed as a result,
Mm,
but
mm,
those sorts of activities require that sort of testing, I think, in some ways, which is natural to the human experience on most everything we do. Whether you're going
yeah.
too fast in a car, get a speeding ticket,
Mm,
or whether you are you don't change your passwords every year and your
mm,
data are breached. I'm less
yeah.
concerned about that because there always will be bad actors, and there's definitely harm
Mm,
associated with that, than that advancement be stymied by an
mm,
overzealous control of innovation. And of
mhm.
course, this is the tension we see all the time, and perhaps is healthy and what makes us human.
Yeah, maybe. Those are really good advice, Peter. I really appreciate you saying that. I want to touch on one last thing here before we wrap up, and that's kind of your legacy. So I had the wonderful advantage of being able to kind of surf in your wake, and kind of draw on you as inspiration and as a mentor and as someone who's helped my career. And I've seen what you've done for others' careers. I don't think I've ever mentioned it to you explicitly, but I work with a lot of people who you've helped along their paths, along their career paths. And I know you have children of your own. So I'm wondering what kind of what is your hope for the future of this field of universal design? After you've retired and decided this is the end of my work, what do you want to see happen in that next generation?
Well, you're very kind. I've had really a blessed life. I've been fortunate to have extraordinary mentors. And if I have a few slogans that I go by, like there are many ways to 21,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps the defining thing for me, it may not work for everybody, is I do good and well when everybody around me does good and well. And I've never I've always felt lucky to work with people like yourself and others because I grow and I learn. And in academics, sometimes we're getting a little off field, but maybe in life too, it's often seen as a zero sum game.
Mm-hmm.
Why did this professor get this office and I didn't? Or why did this person get this job? And I just have always been fortunate to think that I've been very fortunate and blessed to have the opportunity to learn from others. And I tell you, ask my children, I tell my children, I'm lucky I have a lot of colleagues now in this Burton Blatt Institute. It's grown quite a bit. And I think as the quote CEO, I work for everybody in that institute. That is my job to help those people flourish. And when they do, I do, and the community does. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a big believer in legacy per se, but I am a believer in pay it forward. And I think you're in that school, and many of us have tried to do that. And universal design is in that school. We all learn,
Yeah.
unlike poor accessibility standards, there is no endpoint for universal design. It is a function of learning and technology and design. And people like yourself are moving that forward as the next generation. I'm really proud and pleased to know you and talk with you.
It's such an honor. I want to just draw one last aspect out of what you said about being surrounded by people that enrich your life, and I'm wondering, do you think universal design has played a role in that, and kind of bringing diversity into your own personal experience?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I guess if you were to ask me what are some adjectives that I think of describing me, maybe I'm universally designed. Maybe I maybe I, like many people like yourself, try to see the richness and complexity and individual differences not as something that separates us, but something that brings us together. And that's the most interesting part of life to me.
You just gave me chills. I love it. I absolutely love it. All right. I'm going to be very
Well,
respectful of
thank
your
you.
time and wrap up. And I just want to ask you, is there anything else that you would want to say, either to the people who might be listening or just any words to wrap up with?
I would suggest everybody try Ben and Jerry's ice cream. And Cherry Garcia is among my favorite flavors.
Same for me. Same for me. It's my top flavor. And I don't think I can get it here in Norway, so it breaks my heart. But every time I go to the US, I grab a pint or two.
It's a great privilege, pleasure to talk with you, Anthony. And you are the next generation. And I very much look forward to learning more about what you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter, so much.